I just wanted to see how mental health actually shows up in our everyday lives, and how we incorporate it in our broader conversations. I mean, addiction and the way that it shows up, we all think we're exempt to it,
If someone is losing their home and losing their family, they know that they are. So what's the switch? What's the switch to them appraising the need to change? And that's the dialogue that we need to have as a society. In South Africa, we do have access to the social sector that does provide free access to treatment. There are some processes one has to go through to access those. So it's worthwhile investigating in the context that whoever the person is that's listening to this now is keen to access assistance to see what resources are there, because I can guarantee you not all of them cost money.
Welcome back to Mindful Mondays, your weekly dose of mindfulness, where we speak to system builders, system disruptors who are shaping their work through service, purpose, conscious leadership, and storytelling. And today we have someone who's not a stranger to Mindful Mondays. And for those who have been part of Mindful Mondays since we started on Instagram a few years ago, you will know him. His name is Professor Goodman Sibeko. And when I was thinking about guests that I really wanted to speak to, he was one of the highlights, because when we spoke then, he has a way of turning complex information into information that we all can understand. And that's what I enjoyed about our conversation, and no pressure. Goodman Sibeko is a professor of psychiatry, an academic leader, a thought partner in global mental health. His work spans behavioral conditions from mental illness to addiction, with a strong focus on their intersection with public health priorities such as HIV. He contributes to global policy efforts aimed at advancing mental health equity. And while his core research centers on substance use disorders, including alcohol and other drugs, his broader mission is to improve access to screening, treatment, and care, while also deepening public understanding of addiction as a pervasive and often underestimated force in our everyday life. And this is what this conversation is about. We want to speak about how addiction shows up in our everyday life, because I remember when I was in grade 9, they showed us this documentary and it was on hard drugs, but no one speaks about the everyday things that we face and how addiction may show up in those spaces. So welcome.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be back and to do this face to face for a change.
Yeah, because last time we had to do it during COVID and we had to do it over Instagram.
That's right, yeah.
Thank you so much for coming. I mean, when I was reconceptualizing Mindful Mondays now, the first season when we did it, I mean, our topic was mental health, men and mental health. I remember that topic. But I just wanted to see how mental health actually shows up in our everyday lives, and how we incorporate it in our broader conversations. I mean, addiction and the way that it shows up, we all think we're exempt to it, It looks a certain way, it's for that person, not me. But in all the everyday stimuli, I find that it's more prevalent than we think. It's right in front of our eyes, but it's so normalized that we can't even spot it unless it looks like what those documentaries showed us back in the day, which is, the itching, the scratching, someone basically losing everything. But no one speaks about how people function, even with addiction.
I do like that you framed it as mental health and not as mental illness, because a huge part of what we need to start driving towards is maintaining our mental health so that we prevent progression to mental disorder. And it's a really important focus. Even in our interventions, we're trying to say, how do we frame this as interventions geared towards guarding, protecting, providing, supporting mental health, as opposed to, the stigmatized concept of mental illness and mental disorder. So, yeah.
And I mean, you work in global public policy, and I mean, the key thing there is always prevention is better than the cure. So how do we prevent this before it even becomes a mental illness? And I think a lot of what we're trying to do on this podcast now is building mental fitness. So how do we prevent this? How do we make sure that people have the tools to be able to spot or recognize that it can actually happen to me too and normalize it? And I think with mental illness, again, it's the stigma. And where addiction is concerned, again, it's the huge stigma of you messed up. That's always the narrative around addiction. You messed up. But I was reading a lot on what happens to the brain when someone becomes addicted to something and the different chemicals and all of that. And as I was reading, I realized that it could be me. It could be someone that I know.
Yes.
It could be someone that I interact with every single day and I wouldn't even know. And yeah, I just wanted to, I guess, normalize the conversation and start with what are the biggest conceptions about addiction that you think the public still holds, except like what we've already discussed now.
No, of course. And I think very important to frame that at the moment, the United Nations Office on Drug and Crime is focusing on prevention as a key strategy, especially as we start targeting adolescents, knowing that they're at the most, sort of the highest vulnerability of developing substance use disorders down the line. I think linked to that is, one of the most prevalent misconceptions is that having a substance use disorder means that you have a lack of willpower, or it's a moral failing of some sort, or that you're a terrible person. And I think what you've said now is really important, that it could be you or me, because it's really about how our body really navigates this experience of pleasure, the reinforcement of the experience of using the substance, and how it then adjusts our hierarchy of priorities. Our bodies are primed to prioritize food, sex for the maintenance of the species. But with continued substance use, especially if this happens earlier on in life, in adolescence, that hierarchy can be disrupted and substances can become much higher, so that your initial craving for survival appears to be substances as opposed to the things that are really important to sustain you.
And I think the key thing that you mentioned there, maybe I'm just reframing or paraphrasing, but it's also the environment in which you exist in, where the things that you are meant to have to sustain you, what happens when those things also don't exist? Then you have to find other coping mechanisms, where I think as human beings, from my understanding, is that we always look for, the greater feeling that is not the normal feeling, the excitement, the pleasure, to a point where, should it get to a point where we deal with addiction in our own lives, it's very hard to recognize, because that's the narrative that has been built in our environment, pleasure, having a good time. But what does that actually look like in reality? And how does that move from having a good time to needing that as a coping mechanism? And I think maybe the starting point is realizing that addiction is more than just the hard drugs. The everyday drug that's been normalized is alcohol. And then there's also how social media and tech and all of those things come into play. How do we expand our understanding as everyday people of understanding that it's not just, the cocaine or the heroin, but it's also the everyday things in front of us?
So I think what you've also added at the end is the context. And that's a really important concept to understand as we talk about destigmatization and as we talk about the misunderstandings that exist in society. That it's not just that this one individual has decided, I'm going to start drinking alcohol at this volume because I feel like doing it, or because this is, who I am. It's also the context and the environment. We have contexts which are very substance-driven, very alcohol-oriented, and very experimentation-oriented, very oriented around fitting in socially. And what's important to understand is there's nothing wrong with having fun. It's actually important. It's important for social cohesion. It's important for us to have balance in our life. We have busy lives, so we have to have something to counteract that and create some sort of balance for our living experience. So it's okay to have fun. What's important to understand is being able to pick up when the activities that you engage in to relax, to socially integrate, to feel that you're part of a community, are starting to be disruptive in your normal functioning, in the roles that you're committed to. If you're a partner, if it starts disrupting your ability to be a reliable, supportive partner. If you're a parent, it's starting to impact on how you parent. If you're a teacher, it's starting to impact on how you're able to present lessons at school. So when there's functional impairment. So in summary, it's really important to have fun. It's important to have a balanced life. It's also important to understand the context within which you operate and how that might drive your exposure and patterns of use of substances. But also, I think we'll talk about it later as well, is how it then helps to mobilize resources that can support your journey towards recovery.
And I mean, like, it's important to have fun. I think of South Africa as a nation. We are the fun country. From Sunday to Sunday, it's always a good time. But what I notice is that the environment also is not conducive, I guess, to recovery as well. I think of how growing up, or even when you start consuming alcohol, there's this the cause is the cure type of mentality. You know, once you start, you shouldn't stop. And the more you drink, the more you fit in. And this is not just in South Africa. It's a global thing where young people think their rite of passage into coolness and into being accepted is alcohol. And I mean, for someone who has lived with social anxiety, I, from a young age, got to a place where I was like, okay, if I need to fit in, or I need to be social, or I need to be, I guess, extroverted for the night, you know, it just takes a glass of wine and then I'm good. But then you realize, or when you do some introspection, which is years later for me, that it should not be like that. You know, it should be a choice of, okay, I'm drinking this to enjoy this, but not as a means of fitting in or as a rite of passage. But when we zoom out, there have been a lot of dialogues around alcohol consumption, specifically in South Africa. And I know it's a global thing, but how do we then start addressing the beast in the room, or the elephant in the room rather, where, to your point, let's enjoy, you know, let's have a good time. Let's drink responsibly. Let's enjoy responsibly, whatever your thing is, be it going to the casino, which is something that you actually brought to my attention the other day. But how do we actually address the elephant in the room for what it is, instead of just like falling into the traps of, you know, this is just for a good time, when, you know, we've had accidents where people have been drinking under the influence. We've had things that have happened because people have been under the influence of something else. But every time it happens, it's just, you know, we deal with that and then we carry on like business as usual, but we're not actually changing the narrative in our society. And I was also reading books about how, specifically in the South African context, it's very much linked to our past, you know, the past that we've had with apartheid and all of that, and how that has been, that has seeped in our cultures and in our societies. But we are at a place now where the information is readily available. This conversation is happening. We have you here. But how do we then start actually calling it out for what it is and addressing the elephant in the room?
You know, during COVID, we really came face to face with the reality of the impact of alcohol on our systems. You know, when we had the withdrawal of alcohol access, or the limiting of alcohol access, we suddenly saw that our health system was able to deal with other health priorities, because we weren't having as many motor vehicle accidents, traumas and assaults related to substance use. So already that gave us a very clear indication, better than we could have hoped to get under any other sort of opportunity. So that's one thing to reflect on. The other, you know, is that as a society, so much of how we function has substances embedded into it. You know, you were speaking about the spatial history of South Africa, where you find that communities that were much better off had opportunities to learn, to engage in social activities on a much broader spectrum. You know, they could go and play golf, they could play tennis, they could go yachting. So there were all of these other ways to let off steam and to feel connected and to feel an active part of society. Whereas those opportunities were very much more limited in the disadvantaged spaces. And obviously that has led to alcohol taking on a characteristic sense of belonging in our culture. You know, when people talk about the weekend is coming, it's, you know, five down, it's time to grab I'm not going to name the substance. We don't want to advertise inadvertently. But, you know, our culture of relaxation and social connection is so tied in with substance use that we often forget to have an eye open for at what point does it start to indicate a problem. We also have cultural and social activities that are tied with alcohol. When you know, when a dowry is going to be negotiated, you know, the groom's family arrives and presents alcohol, and there's a normalization of strange behavior linked to substances. Think about your family. There's always that uncle, you know, that everyone says, he's just like that. And so because of the normalization of how we relate to substances, and especially alcohol in our context, there's this element of, well, no, this is who we are. You know, alcohol is how we connect. Alcohol is how we meet. Alcohol is how we show respect to our elders and how we connect. And so that's something that really needs to be tackled. And I don't know if that looks like a cultural dialogue, if it looks like a social engagement that looks at to what extent does the involvement of substances in some of our cultural practices actually serve the initial intention of what was meant to be achieved with that practice versus the risks that are related now. And that links to also then as an individual, when you're engaging with substances, being able to come back and say, do I understand why I'm using this substance? You were talking about the fact that for you, somebody with social anxiety, and I identify, we were speaking about this the other day, that I myself also suffer from social anxiety. It's a question of saying, why am I using this substance? If I'm using this substance so that I can, function better in society, and that if I don't have it, then I can't function, appropriately or effectively, then we need to look at what is this that you are trying to fix, and is there another way to fix it that has less potential harm? It's about identifying the reason and the timing of use, because you might find if you're using it because you're saying, I can't have a meal without it, and then you say, well, what is it about having this substance that makes me enjoy my meal? So you might say it's, it lubricates and allows me to enjoy it. It's the flavor, it's the taste. And you might find there are other alternatives way to achieve that. So it's really, as a society, going back to understand what are the practices that continue to support our exposure and use of substances. Are they still relevant? Do we need to relook at how we're engaging with substances in those contexts? What are the social contexts that we are using as individuals and as communities? Are those appropriate? Do we need to revisit and find more adaptive ways of doing that? And what does it look like for us to replace those substances? And I think we'll talk, as we talk more now, about the disruptions that happen when the substance use starts moving away from just regular use to disruptive use, to addiction, and then disrupting sort of societal functioning. And we'll talk about that when we get there.
But I think something that you mentioned is culture. And I mean, even spiritually, especially in African cultures, even when they speak to their ancestors, it's alcohol based.
Yes.
So it's very much a part, I guess, of who we are. But you were like, maybe it's a culture-based dialogue. But I think a lot of it has to do with education as well, because we are speaking about this from a perspective of understanding that this is something that's very harmful, just not even beyond just you doing it and having a good time, maybe even driving, but it's something that can, which we're going to touch on now, can harm our well-being, our minds. I think the prevalence of even what happens to the liver is only coming to the fore now, where, someone back in the day, if they die because of alcohol use, it's because they were poisoned, but then the actual substance in itself is a poison. The craziest thing for me was reading that, or someone said to me, the same alcohol they use in sanitizer is the same alcohol that you're drinking. And it took me a minute. I was like, oh, actually, And when you put that into perspective, you understand what it actually is. In the context of South Africa, knowing the culture, and this is not just in South Africa as well, as across the continent and across the world, how do we start interacting specifically with alcohol in a healthier way, where yes, you can have a good time, but it's also important to investigate why you drink. I mean, in Italy, I've heard that every meal has to have a glass of wine or something, a glass of red wine. But how do we start interacting with it in a way that is not harmful to us? And how do we become mindful of how we engage with substances, be it alcohol or even anything that we like to have a good time? But I mean, alcohol is more part of our culture, but how do we start interacting with it mindfully, if there is a way to interact mindfully with alcohol?
You're reminding me of my radio interview 2 weeks ago, where the interviewer answered all my questions in your question. And I think that represents, it reflects your deep understanding of this, and I appreciate that. I think what's really important, this might be controversial, so I might be dropping your ratings now, is for us to remember that culture is actually a living thing. And I think we sometimes forget that. We hold on to old practices because somehow, in terms of how we learn about culture, we are led to believe that that's what must be done. But we fail to remember that those practices were taken on at the time for a reason, and they were time appropriate, and that culture can evolve. So that's just something I want to just leave out there. maybe in a future conversation we can have.
Are we saying it's a choice?
I didn't say that. But I think there's certainly an aspect of culture that we can say, yes, okay, so why are we doing that? Then let's go back to saying, is there a meaningful way for us to achieve the same thing in a different way that is appropriate for where we are now as a society? We know as a society now that we have a dysfunctional relationship with alcohol. We know as a society now that, you were talking about access to information and education. Never before have we had such sort of just ubiquitous access to information. So it's about really allowing people to understand how best to access that information. I was just having a conversation with one of your producers before we started about how do you decide what's the correct information? How do you find your way through? So it's also about teaching us how to get through all the fluff and really find the really is important information. So what you were talking about now, understanding that alcohol is actually a toxin, that it affects your body in all these ways. Many of these substances increase your likelihood of developing cancer, so they're known to be carcinogens. But because of how they interact with our reward system, they are able to convince our bodies that, no, we really got to get this in us in spite of the harm that it might cause. So education is a really important thing. And I think it's also very important for us to step back and say, of course, have a good time. Of course, connect with each other. Of course, growing up and experiencing life is about experimentation, which happens a lot in the teens and as people start out in college, university. So we also have to be mindful of those spaces. Is how do we make sure that folks have access to the correct information within those vulnerable spaces? But not only that they are also able to interrogate the information to identify the really important bits. Every weekend my mom sends me a WhatsApp video she's received from someone at church. And this is in spite of her having a professor for a son. So she's more likely to believe something she's heard from a church WhatsApp group. And so it's really about teaching society what is a reliable source and which sources of information are really placed there to excite us and get us acting in ways which might actually not be to our best interest. So I think those are the main things. But I think at the back of our minds, we must always remember to appreciate the human experience and to validate the reasons that people are engaging in substance use, which we do on an individual level and at a community level as well. When you are using a substance, you must understand why you are doing it. And it's also important to remember that the frequency of use is probably not as important as the dose and the effect and any adverse effect that might come. So you were talking about the fact that in Italy, people have a glass of wine with their meals every day. If you're doing that and it's a glass of wine and it has absolutely no other impact, there's no health consequence, there's no social dysfunction that results, there's no dependence that develops, you can't say that there's a harm to that. But I say that in the background of the fact that recently the WHO has actually come out and said there's actually no benefit to using alcohol at all, that there are only risks involved. So that's a whole other conversation. But I think it's about normalizing access to information, normalizing skills for interrogating quality of information, but also recognizing why people need that to function at a normal societal level.
You said something that just stuck with me, is appreciating the reasons why people use alcohol. Because so many times we're so quick to say, this is wrong. Don't do this, don't do that. But very rarely do we afford them the respect of asking why. I
think so. And I think that applies across the public health, information strategy. If you put up a signboard that says, don't drink, don't do this, don't do that. For me, I'm saying, well, you don't understand my circumstances. Whereas perhaps what we really need to do is engage on what are all of these things that we're dealing with as a society. We are historically a traumatized society as South Africans, and that trauma continues today. We've got high crime levels, high levels of unemployment, high levels of gender-based violence, which also has a horrible relationship with substances. So we must understand that we are living in difficult times and people need an escape. So how do we say to these folks, don't drink? What are we giving them as an option? What alternative ways are we helping people to navigate their daily stresses?
And I mean, it's not just, I think like to your point, what are we giving people? What are we replacing their coping mechanisms with? And I always think back to this video by the former First Lady of Namibia. And she was speaking about how not just South Africa, but Africans are like traumatized. We are a traumatized continent based on the things that have happened to us. And she was speaking about how you see it in our leadership and their means of coping when they are in positions of power and how they interact with power. Obviously, in those contexts, we think it's different, but it's actually not when you look at how, yes, they have that access, but when you look lower down to the everyday person, what are they supposed to be using? Because they don't interact with, like the higher forms of access that everyone else may have. Because that's the other thing, access. Because the core of it is also access to mental health services and mental health support, understanding what mindfulness is, because you're saying, yes, it's okay to, not you're saying it's okay to drink, but should you want to have fun? Understand why you're using this specific thing to have fun. Understand why this is the thing that you're using as a coping mechanism. But very rarely are they in spaces where those conversations are being had. It took me, because at first it was, I only drink on a Saturday. That was me, right? But I didn't understand that the dosage also matters, because for me, it's the frequency, right? If I don't drink every day, it's not a problem. And then I would say to myself, I'm going to have one glass of wine. But I've had a hectic week at school. I see my friends, I'm excited. One glass turns into 3. The next morning when I wake up, it's the cycle of almost like, I don't want to say self-loathing, but it's a discipline issue to me, because you said you're going to have 1, but you had 3. But you understand how that happens so often in our society, right? And then I realized that, yes, I was doing it to have fun, to like let loose, blow some steam off. And then I realized that, again, this thing found me at a place where I'm incredibly stressed. I'm very low, and it's leaving me lower than where it found me, right? And that prompted wanting to investigate, what is it that alcohol does to our minds? Before that, I think it was a year or 2 ago, my partner says to me, I was like, no, alcohol is not that bad, red wine. That's what I said. Red wine is not that bad. Apparently it's healthy for us. And then he's like, I don't want to blow your bubble, so I'm just not going to say anything. Because research from the WHO that you're saying like right now, is that the truth is, I've read that too. And I think we're also very selective in how we absorb information as well. Because after that evening of like having 3 glasses instead of 1, I felt low for the whole week. And I just couldn't understand, why do I feel this low? And I remember feeling so low that I couldn't even get out of bed. It ruined my entire week. And it wasn't the type of thing where, culturally, and I mean not culturally as in my Venda culture, but culturally with my friends in my social settings, the cause is the cure. It wasn't one of those. No. It was something feels different here. We've always heard that alcohol is a depressant, but you're selective with your information. They said red wine is not bad. I had a Pinot Noir. What do you mean? And then I made the decision, I'm going to stop for a little bit, not because I think I have a problem, but because it's a discipline thing for me. But then I started downloading this app, and I asked it to give me facts about what's actually happening in my body when I do drink. So when I interact with alcohol again, I understand what it is I'm actually putting into my body. Because for years I haven't understood. It's fun. You go out, you dance, you have a good time. I've had great times with my friends in different places, partying, whatever. But I actually never understood what it is that I'm putting into my body. And then I started doing the research. Every day it would give me a new fact. And it's scary. It's scary once you start understanding what's going on to the brain, how it affects your behavior, how it almost builds a pattern, because that's what addiction is it's a pattern, like you get super excited and then your body wants to stay at a place where it's always excited. But when I started reading more and more on it, how it shrinks this, how it shrinks, I was like, I wish I had known. I would have interacted with it completely differently. I would have been more mindful of what it is that I'm putting into my body. But I don't think people know. Like, I didn't know for years until 6 months ago when I stopped. Could you explain what happens to, I don't want to say our brains, but like in our brains and behaviorally when someone becomes addicted, whether to alcohol or to like scrolling on Instagram or gambling, which is something that we don't really speak about.
So I think, you said a few things that I want to reflect on. The question about how our leaders behave when they come into power. If you come from a population that hasn't had access before, and suddenly you see all this access, and you just want to hoard it, and that's what happens when power is hoarded. But again, that's a topic for another podcast, which we'll get to. And I think importantly in our strategies, the very important element is validation, is validating people's experiences, validating the journey that's led them to engage with substances in the way that they have. I think what you've done is you've demonstrated a desire to become self-aware. And a lot of people don't have that. A lot of people don't have a natural inclination to want to understand why they engage in behaviors that they do. They don't necessarily want to engage in a journey that helps them understand, why do I hear things the way I do? What filter am I experiencing the world through? What impact do the words I choose have on other people? So there are deeper levels of self-awareness that perhaps if we were able to create a societal culture where folks feel comfortable that they'd like to do that, but also have access to resources that allow them to have those journeys. Those are some of the ways in which people can start identifying why they engage in patterns of behavior in general, but of substance use that might not be helpful to them. I think it's important to understand that what substances do is they hijack the reward pathway of the body. So our bodies are designed to make sure we stay alive. And so how do you stay alive? You stay alive by eating food. You stay alive through procreation. You stay alive by keeping ourselves safe. And so what substances do is they trigger those pathways. And so suddenly the pleasure associated with the activities which are designed to keep us alive. Now, really, I've just said that in a complex way, so I'm going to simplify it. The upside of food and sex is that it feels good. It feels amazing to have good food. It feels great to be engaged in a sexual activity. And so what substances do is they hijack that pleasure component and they change our hierarchy. So where, food might initially have been at the highest level of generation pleasure, and there might have been other needs that are far lower, substances then hijack that and become the priority. And what then happens is that our bodies then need less the things that we needed to survive and need more urgently the things that are disrupting our function, which oddly enough are giving us pleasure, which are the substances. That's basically what happens. And then that affects our ability to discern and make decisions which are sort of geared towards protecting us. And that's because of how it affects the prefrontal cortex in terms of decision making and in terms of discerning what we need to do. And so that's basically how addiction works. I don't know, have I answered your question or do I need to say more? Yeah, and I think in terms of the use of technology, it has a similar effect. Obviously, you don't have the chemical impact which results from using substances, but the reward we get from the notifications, from the bright screen, and from seeing and engaging with content that makes us feel good or makes us feel validated, that drives that pleasure center that then becomes a need. And after time, you find that the engagement we have with social media and with technology actually becomes less interesting to us. And so what we are then doing is we're then scrolling to see if we can find another thing that's going to stimulate us again. So a lot of the time that we're scrolling, we're not actually enjoying what we're seeing. We're just waiting for the next thing that's going to be great to see. And it's the same with substances. You're never ever going to get that first high again. That's part of chasing the high that happens with people who become dependent on substances. Is they might engage in a cocaine use the first time and you have this exceptional high, and then they just constantly chase and you never get it again. But you just believe that if you keep trying and trying different volumes, that eventually you'll get there. And I think that also speaks to the fact that the more you use, the more volume your body needs because you develop tolerance. So over time, your one glass of Pinot Noir doesn't do it for you. So you might need to take 2, you might need to take 3. Might need to take 4. And the more you take, the higher the exposure to the toxic effects of substances, the higher the possibility of developing addiction, dependence, and then addiction, because there is a differentiation between the two. So,
I'm going to ask you to differentiate.
No, of course. So, with dependence, there's a physical dependence. So because of the changes that happen at a cellular level, your body changes how it interacts with dopamine, which is the substance that drives our neuronal activity that determines our pleasure experience. And so in the same way, I've lost my train of thought. I hope you're going to edit this out.
No, like you were talking about the difference between dependency and then addiction, and how when the one glass of Pinot Noir doesn't do it, you might need 2, 3, or 4. So like how the rewards, how the first high, you'll never reach it again, but the body starts thinking that if I consume more,
and so
I'll get that.
So you develop tolerance, and over time, your body starts saying to you, "Actually, we can't function without this," and that's where you start developing things like withdrawal. And so you have a physical dependence. You cannot get through the day without a hit of alcohol. You can't get through a day without getting access to cocaine. So that's the physical health manifestation of dependence. Addiction is the behaviors that you then exhibit. So it's the disruptive behavior. It's in spite of understanding the negative consequence and in spite of becoming aware of the impact on your life and on the people around you, you still engage in excessive use. You engage in criminal activity. You engage in behaviors that are harmful to you and others. So addiction is the physical manifestation. Dependence is the physical manifestation. Addiction is all of the other sort of behavioral elements that then come into play as a result of the dependence.
So people are, let's say you are addicted or you've become dependent and then addicted. There is an awareness of that this is very harmful, like when someone engages in criminal activity, because I think the other thing in trying to normalize the conversation and looking at it from a mental health lens and trying to destigmatize it is also just, I guess, the accountability to it, which is, do people actually understand or see it? Because if dependency is the physical part, which is, I need this, the addiction part is, I see that this is bad.
But I'm going to do it anyway.
But I want to do it anyway because I need it.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think that really speaks to, when we try to help people who have a substance use disorder. So we actually don't use the term addicted that much anymore because we're trying to be more person-centered. And we're using language now where we're trying to, when we spoke earlier, we were talking about validating the fact that having a substance use disorder doesn't represent a moral failing. And we know that historically, people who were addicts were seen as having a moral failing or being lesser than. So we are trying to change the language in terms of how we refer to people. So people with a substance use disorder, in order to help someone with a substance use disorder or a drug use disorder, the really important element is insight and their desire to engage in a process that moves them forward. And part of that is appraising, again, as we mentioned earlier, why am I using? What volumes am I using? What is the immediate impact? What's the longer term impact? And of course, the reality is, in the same way that you were saying, you started to see a pattern in the result of your use of the alcohol and started to see that, no, man, this is disrupting my functioning. The question becomes, what then is the trigger for a change in behavior? And it's about understanding where is this person in this journey of trying to establish what behaviors they need to change to ensure a healthier future for themselves, a better functioning at work, a better social functioning. So and this is what motivational interviewing is about as well. It's about saying, we meet you where you are. We figure out where are you in your own understanding of your relationship with substances, your own understanding of the impact of substances, the extent of information that you have. Given all of that, and given the clearly perceptible impact this is having on your functioning, where would you like to go? Would you like to see yourself in a different place in your relationship with substances? This goes back to that conversation we were having earlier about it doesn't work to say to people, don't drink, don't smoke, don't do this. You have to say to them, alcohol does A, B, C, D. The impact on your life will be A, B, C, D. What choice would you like to make? And it's a very difficult position to take from us because our natural position is to be paternalistic because we have all the information to tell people what to do. But the reality, and this ties again in with what we were talking about earlier, is empowering people with the correct information and empowering people with the ability to discern the correct elements and the relevant portions of information, because there's so much out there that's not important. But then importantly, then assisting folks in generating a desire to become self-aware and to become aware of options for how to change. But also importantly, understanding that they don't need to continue to have the dysfunction that they have now, that they can have a dream, they can have a vision for where they'd like to be. And then our role as folks in the treatment space is to say, let's help you navigate this. Let's help figure out what the resources are to figure out where you want to be versus where you are now. And part of that is about saying, what's your relationship with the substance? Let's talk about that. Let's talk about what you need to reduce your use. Because again, we're talking about dependence. There's physical dependence. So it's not just that they can just stop tomorrow necessarily and they'll be fine. There's going to be physical withdrawal consequences. There's going to be social consequences. If they've been using substances within a social group, they're going to maybe need to reduce their exposure to that group and find a new group. So there's a lot of loss involved in the journey towards recovery. And they're going to need to be willing to do all that. But it's about negotiating with them which elements of their relationship with substance use need to be really engaged with to move them to where. And then it's about where they want to go and not about where we think they should be as practitioners.
Because the big part of it is the acceptance. So it needs to be a conversation. It needs to be a collaborative effort, because like to your point earlier, it's one thing to just want to impose stop, but it's easier said than done when there are so many other moving parts that I guess sustain or maintain this addiction or this dependency rather, like the social setting. I mean, a lot of people who may be listening to this are thinking, when I go out with my friends, that's all we do, you know. So if I'm stopping, that means I don't go out with them as often, you know. But then the other thing is also just really looking within your life to see if there are people or certain environmental, I guess, triggers. How do they almost navigate that? We're going to touch on that a little bit later, because that's usually the big part. When I was thinking about stopping alcohol, it wasn't something that I was dependent on, but I knew that's something that I did socially. And I just got worried. I'm like, when I go out, I'm just going to be awkward. I'm going to sit there and be anxious, and I'm just going to be weird. And it's almost like you're being exposed finally, because you need to just sit there for hours and have a conversation. And I love conversation, but sometimes it's hard because you're going to like a place where you would ordinarily start with this and do that. But what I also found is when the right people are in your life, you find it easier to also express that. You know, this is my first time being out. I'm a little bit nervous because usually when I come here, I've got social anxiety. So this is what I usually order. But there's a lot of safe spaces that we need to build for that to happen. I mean, as you were talking, I actually wanted to write down some of the questions that we need to ask ourselves, but I'll ask you later so we can also just make sure that information is available, not in an essay that is 50 pages. But the other thing that I wanted to touch on is we're speaking a lot about alcohol, our environments, and how when people interact with it, we shouldn't just go and say, stop this now. We're not even asking why you are using it, what dosage, what frequency, and all of that. The other thing that we touched on in our conversation before this was gambling. You know, with social media, you touched on it very briefly around what happens when you doom scroll and when we are on Instagram or whatever, we're looking for that thing. You know, you see that the real culture right now, where there's a reel that made you laugh and now you're looking for the same thing. So what happens with me is I save videos and I go back to the same video again, hoping to have the same laugh that I got or the same feeling that I got or the same high. But gambling is something that I've been seeing a lot. I remember I used to get a bus when I was going to school in my undergrad year, and it'd be 6 a.m. and I'd see like an old lady walking out of the casino and she's asking for money to get home because she was at the casino. And I feel like even alcohol is becoming, the conversations around alcohol are becoming more prevalent, but with gambling, it's not. And it's something that's happening right in front of our eyes. You literally get the ads while you're on your phone. It's even in the gaming, the apps that we have. And it's an, I guess, nice social thing that people do. But can we touch on that a little bit? Because you also told me about new stats that are coming out as well.
Yeah, I think, it's about chasing that thing, right? It's about chasing that high. In the same way that when you're scrolling through social media, you're hoping for validation. And a lot of people, will post something and then they'll keep going back to see how many likes they've got now, how many comments they've had, if anybody's shared it. Maybe they had one viral post that really, it made them feel, I actually matter. What I have to share is important. And then when they make subsequent posts, they're trying to chase that same virality again. So they keep, refreshing to check. And then it might even take down posts that haven't been successfully, as successful as the other one. So that's certainly one thing on the social media side. The same thing happens with gambling. Think about the lotto. How many times have you played the lotto? Then you win 15 rand. And you just think, just 5 zeros. Right? If only there were just 5 zeros out there at 15. So let me just do it again. And it's the same thing, right? In terms of people who go to casinos, they'll have these little micro wins that make them think they can, if they just stay on a little bit longer. And of course, all the sounds and the smells and the music and the color of the machines are all part of this drone of activity that drives them towards, yes, if I just keep going, yes, if I just keep going, yes, if I just keep going, I'll eventually get there. Then there comes the person who has a big win and they think, if I go home now, I may miss what might actually come next. Whereas if I put all this back in, I might get an even bigger win. And then what happens if that person loses? You have that grandmother that you encountered on the bus who suddenly loses everything. So it's all this constant rush or hunt for that rush of winning, that sense of validation on social media. And it's designed to do that. The way the notifications, that's why my phone is turned down. That's why we do that when we're having conversations, because it's designed to draw you to turning it on. And once you're hooked into the algorithm, you're off. And of course, the algorithm is designed so that not only are you being exposed to things that might give you that rush and reward, but these are things that you've somehow told the algorithm you like. So for me, it'll be a whole bunch of dogs, and it'll be, cats and things like that. But it'll keep showing you that because in the middle of that, somewhere you're hoping you're going to see the one video that again reminds you of the original feeling you had before. So that's really the driver. So in origin, substance use and technology addiction and gambling addiction all hijack the same pathways. But because there aren't necessarily chemicals that are being taken in when it comes to technology and gambling, you won't necessarily have the same physical withdrawal, but the impact on social functioning, on individual functioning, on relationships is equally terrible. So people may lose marriages, they may lose their jobs, they might end up borrowing a lot of money so that they can gamble and then go into severe debt and might lose things they've worked for their whole life. And when we go back to the discussion we were having earlier about self-awareness, where you said, actually, I'm doing this every weekend, but do I really need to do this? I'm not dependent, but I'm feeling like this might be becoming problematic. It's about saying, what do we need to do at a societal level to make us all more self-aware individually and also as communities and as society when behaviors are actually immediately impacting and also in the medium and long term on our quality of life. If someone is losing their home and losing their family, they know that they are. So what's the switch? What's the switch to them appraising the need to change? And that's the dialogue that we need to have as a society.
And for someone who, let's say they are at a place where it's now an addiction, and you've lost your family and you've lost jobs, or you feel like you just can't stop, or you feel like I'm too far gone. Because that's the other side of the conversation where people feel like I'm too far gone. It is what it is. It's a part of my life. And it's also the conversations we have with ourselves that actually maintain some of these things. Is it possible to heal from the dependency? Is it possible? I was reading on that app I was telling you about. It asked me if I want affirmations or if I want the facts. And I was like,
Right.
give me the facts, because it's the facts, not that scare us to submission, but it's almost like understanding what is actually happening. And when I read that something happens to my prefrontal cortex and all of these things and how it shrinks, I'm like, what do you mean it shrinks? But there was an upside. I think the word was neuroplasticity. For a person who feels like I'm too far gone, you start counting the number of years that you've been doing this for. You start thinking about how it's too late. I've already lost this. Let me wait for my one big chance, be it with gambling. And if it's alcohol or any other substances, they feel like I've been doing this for 10 years. Like I look at myself and I barely recognize myself. Should I stop right now? Can I actually have good quality of life? Does the brain go back to what it was? Can you almost go back to a state of just being healthy? Or is there such a thing as being too far gone?
The good news is the human body is designed to heal itself. And so over time, it's definitely possible. There might be instances, for example, if you are suffering from an opioid use disorder, where you may need some medication to carry you along, which we call opioid agonist therapy or medication-assisted therapy. But thankfully, with a reduction in use and with engagement with resources geared towards helping somebody on their journey towards recovery, it is possible for the brain to regain some of its functioning. So the good news, it's the shortest answer I'm giving it today, is that yes, definitely it's possible. What just needs to happen is that, again, it's about evaluating the triggers, evaluating what it is that's the gap that's individual is trying to fill, and what resources are you going to put in place to address those gaps. So if somebody is using a substance because it enables them to engage socially, and they are intending to then withdraw that, is what's going to replace that? So it's really about looking at what the social capital is of that individual, looking at what other resources are in place that can help them manage the things that have caused them to start drinking. So it's about validating the individual's experience. It's about giving them space to explore and understand the impacts of the substance use that they may not have intended, and then helping them navigate that journey towards where they'd like to be. It's not easy, and I think that's really important, and that's why an evaluation of social capital and health access resources is really important. But there's no such thing as far gone. There's always an option to engage on a path that can lead towards recovery.
And in that, like meeting people where they are, not where we want them to be. There's two camps where I think we've touched a lot on alcohol today, which is the everyday, person. But there's two camps who say, okay, I don't totally want to like let go of, my alcohol use or whatever I'm using. So what do I do? What are the strategies for me to just reduce and be mindful? Again, it's the 4 questions that you mentioned. But what strategies do you employ where someone's why needs the replacement, as you said? If they're using it to be socially, to be social, or using it to, I don't know, cope with stress at work and to stay awake, or whatever the reason may be, what are the common strategies that you use for someone who doesn't want to totally abstain, but can be mindful of how they use the alcohol? And then the other camp is, okay, I really want to stop, but I may not necessarily have the resources to be able to replace certain things in my life. How do I even begin to reassess beyond the 4 questions, to reassess and rewire not only my brain, but my lifestyle? But me doing that is a lot harder than just me going to the fanciest rehab center. What does that actually look like for someone who wants to just start at least having that conversation with themselves before they seek medical support? Like you're saying, withdrawal is not easy. Yeah.
See, now this is where I wish I had my piece of paper, because as you were talking, I was like, this is what I said, this one. So hopefully I cover it all. I think what's really important is to really for us to grapple with this idea that some people may not want to abstain, and what it means in the greater scheme of things for us on our side who are trying to help them. Is what does it mean for us as well? So not just for them to decide that that's what they want, but what does it mean for us and our journey to want to help them? And how do we appraise that? But it is very important to help a person identify their own goals. And there are people who say, I just don't want to stop. But I think the other important thing to talk about is there are instances where the person's use is disruptive to a point of risking their own livelihood and their own reputation to a degree which waiting for them to make that decision might not be feasible. Right. And so that's where for us in our context in South Africa, the Mental Health Care Act would come in. So, and we are seeing a lot of cases in the media now of folks who are out in the community disrupting communities, stealing, committing crimes, either under the influence or as a way to make money to buy substances. And those are circumstances where we then have to say personal good versus greater good versus societal good. So there are instances where someone is not a candidate for reduced use. They are somebody who needs to stop entirely. And that comes out on an individual assessment. Then we need to look at, what are the prescripts of the law? And I think thankfully for our context, certainly our constitution is very person-centered and rights-oriented. So in our context, our individuals are very safe. But there are contexts where someone who is engaged with the criminal justice system because of their engagement with substances goes down a far more punitive pathway that may not lead them to obtaining recovery, whether that recovery again looks like reduced use or no use at all. So I think we have to be mindful of that. So there are limits, the same way that there are limits to any right. There's also a limit to us saying, we will honor your desire in terms of what your outcome should be in this process. I think, we touched on motivational interviewing and what we've been talking about now. I just did a podcast on motivational interviewing. Did I send it to you?
No, you didn't.
I'll send it to you. So I'm good friends with the developers of motivational interviewing, wonderful people. And the idea of motivational interviewing is again saying collaboratively with the client, because you and I sitting here, I can give you all the advice I want, but you're the expert on your life. You know everything that has brought you where you are, and you understand your trepidations, you understand your strengths. And so you are the expert. And so I collaboratively as the clinician or the practitioner, my job is to help you walk down the path of sort of discovering where do you need to be and what does the journey look like to get you from where you are now. And there's a few steps involved in that. I won't go into too much detail about those now, but it's really about nurturing your motivation for change, evaluating your motivation for change, and then assisting you with resources to get you there. And you mentioned earlier that someone might say, well, I don't have the resources. I think the important thing to reframe there is when we say resources, we often think about money and we often think about medication. We often think about expensive therapists. Those are not all the resources that exist. There are free resources.
Okay.
This is called Mindful Mondays. And when we had a chat a couple of days ago, I was, talking to you about mindfulness practice. Nature is a mindfulness hub. How you exist and interact with nature, how you nurture relationships with other people is a mindfulness hub. My conversations with you are always wonderful, and they're a mindfulness space. So you don't have to pay for everything. And so it's also about really analyzing what we mean by resources. And earlier on, I mentioned social capital. So social capital is going back and saying, okay, fine, you're anxious about the fact that you might lose this friend group because they're the ones who are driving your engagement with substances. The reality is, part of what might make you want to consider changing is because your relationship with substance is impacting your other relationships. What are those relationships? Why are they important? Why is your partner important? Why is your best friend important? Because they nurture something in you, because they're a support. There's your social capital. So it's about reframing and saying, you might feel like you're losing something because this is feeding an automatic pattern of behavior for you. But if we sit down and we make a list of all of your social sort of resources, you will discover that you do have other resources. And it's also true that it's possible to find spaces to engage with new free human resources. I just recently came back from Berlin, and what I loved about Berlin is people playing in the streets in the evening, grown-ups, because this is not something that we see a lot in our country. They go and they go to the park and they just go and kick a ball around with strangers, and there's no phone inside.
I love that.
So there are ways in which, as a society, we can reorient ourselves towards creating activities and spaces that are more socially cohesive. I'm not saying they don't exist. I know that in Joburg, certainly, there's all these paddle clubs, there's tennis clubs, you can go to gym. So there are things, but those cost money. But there are ways to do this for free. You can go to the park on the weekend, you can take a walk on the beach, you can go to places that involve social activities that you don't need to pay for, but where you will encounter people and have to, like book clubs, things like that. And I think peer recovery as well. You're not alone. You're not the first person on this journey.
Yeah.
Find people who've had this journey before. And while understanding that their particular journey and particular triggers might have been different to yours, you will find things here and there that will help you navigate your journey. So it's about peers, and it's also other interventions that we can use. We've got cognitive behavior therapy, we've got contingency management, which form part of a sort of a planned or case-managed treatment strategy. In South Africa, we do have access to the social sector that does provide free access to treatment. There are some processes one has to go through to access those. So it's worthwhile investigating in the context that whoever the person is that's listening to this now is keen to access assistance to see what resources are there, because I can guarantee you not all of them cost money.
And I think it goes back to the basics, but with something that you said there, even with the Berlin people playing around, I think it's a sense of community as well that goes a long way. And even the peer-to-peer conversations of people who have been through it. And I just want to go back to something that you highlighted, that each person's experience is unique, because their why, and specifically their why, is very different to the next person's why. Their history may be different. What got them to that point may be different. But a friend of mine said to me when we were speaking about grief, she said, she's dealing with grief, I'm dealing with grief. She said, I may not know how you feel, but I know how it feels. The journey of getting everything together. I don't want to say getting your life together, but going back to a place where you feel like I've got this under control again, in a healthy way. But to your point, even with mindfulness, I got home after our conversation a couple of days ago. I'm like, I actually really like what you said about actually realizing you as a human being on this earth. When you're walking, you said, feel the back of your foot, as it goes up and it goes down. But just being mindful of what is going on in your body. Mindfulness is just sitting with yourself sometimes, reading a book. And my therapist during COVID, because there was honestly nothing more we could do, she said it's as simple as going outside and taking a walk to the gate and coming back. And I was like, really? She's like, it's the little wins sometimes that build up to the bigger wins, and for someone who needs to totally abstain or wants to start slowly and really recognize, I guess, their patterns, it's sitting with yourself and having those conversations too. I know a lot of us, again, feel like, no, I don't really have a problem. I don't really have a problem. But just a last word on how does one consume mindfully, not just alcohol, but information, consume mindfully, like even social media. It's a blanket statement, but I think consuming mindfully can be applicable across the board, because you need to ask yourself the same questions.
Yeah, and mindfulness is one of those few resources, right? It doesn't cost anything, takes a bit of practice, but once you get into the rhythm of it, it's quite helpful. And it also teaches you to become aware of your own body. You become aware of your place in space, your place in the world, your place in you. You start becoming aware of how your heart beats, the rhythm of you breathing in and breathing out, the rhythm of how your fingers move. When you do something, when you make a cup of coffee, how you hold the cup and how it feels in your hand, the sound of the steam when it comes. So all of those things are opportunities that don't cost anything. And I think as an extension of that, the reason we're having this conversation is because our first conversation felt good. It felt like this is something that is constructive and that feels like it's going to lead to something good. So we're like, we'd like to do this again. When you were engaging with wine the way that you said you were, the following week you didn't feel so good. And that's that your body has ways of talking to you when you learn to listen to it. And then you said, no, let me just reevaluate. What happens if I don't drink? Does that feeling come back? So it's about being aware and being grounded in how your environment makes you feel. Those people that you hang around with and use, those substances in a disruptive way, when you leave, do you feel fulfilled at a deeper level? Do you feel like you've been nurtured? Versus when you go home to the person who says to you, I'm concerned about your use. Do they nurture a safety for you? So I think it's about allowing our bodies to be the litmus. And that's what mindfulness is. It's about allowing our bodies to tell us what's working for us and what's not working for us. And I think that's the real, but it takes practice, which is weird, right? Because we're literally part of nature. We are part of the trees. We're part of the wind. We're part of everything. I'm part of this chair. I'm sitting on it right now. But the fact that we have to practice becoming aware of those things is actually quite bizarre, but it's the reality.
It's just life is full of distractions.
That's it. It's full of distractions. And that's partly what, substances are, what social media is, what tech is, what gambling is. It's all of these distractions from the harder job of actually just being simply present and aware. So part of that journey is coming back to learning how to use our bodies as the litmus to validate our experience so that we can be able to accept when we've been given a warning that, no, this is not for you, or a genuinely safe and constructive reward to say, yes, this is good for you.
And just touching on the distraction, something that someone posted on Twitter a few months ago, they said the hardest thing you can ever do in life is be sober, because you really have to sit with yourself. You become aware of the little things, how you interact with people, the conversations you're having, you're actually there, But I think mindfulness has been one of the best things for me because I always thought I was overly aware. I don't know if there's a thing of being overly self-aware, but it's helped me so much because the moment I felt like that, there was no two ways about it. I'd never felt like that before. There was no two ways about it that I had to stop. But I don't think I would have noticed if I was not self-aware that this is what's happening in my body right now. And the body can only heal itself if you're listening to it.
One of the things we spoke about 2 days ago was silencing your thoughts and how that interfaces with mindfulness. A lot of the thoughts we have are potentially maladaptive, and they can drive us towards behaviors that are not good for us. So part of mindfulness is learning to quiet yourself, to trust your space, and to let your mind is going to do what it does. Mind is designed to think, but learning to let it think and to not necessarily buy the rhetoric.
Yeah. Every time I speak to you, I'm always so grateful that you have a way of making the big concepts sound like everyday concepts. I think this conversation specifically, I felt like it was needed because we see it all the time. We see it all around us. But one thing I've realized about mental health in general and the things around it, such as addiction, is that no one is exempt from it. And I just want to say thank you for this conversation because it shows that in the little things, like when you're talking about the high that we look for when we're on our social medias. We've all been there, until 3 a.m.
Yes.
Looking for that video. You see that one video now, you keep scrolling and you keep scrolling. And then next thing is 3 a.m. and you need to be up at 6. That's actually impacting your life. And same thing with alcohol. For me, when people ask me, I don't say I've quit, I say I've stopped, because it's reevaluating the relationship and seeing if I'd like to continue, if the reasons why I even started still exist now that I've actually done the work of being self-aware. And it's not something that I'm rushing to do or forcing myself to do, but it's just seeing how my body feels, without it. My mornings are easier, the little things have become easier. I sit and I have a great time. but I'm also building better relationships with people, because the moment I speak to you and I feel safe with my social anxiety, and we can have a conversation for hours and I don't feel like, oh, no, I'm awkward. That just shows that I'm in the right place as well. There's a peace that I feel when I'm around the right people. And I'm learning those things. It feels like I'm learning myself for the first time in a long time. But it's also understanding that this conversation cannot just be a conversation that you and I have as friends. No. It needs to be a conversation that a lot of us have even in our homes.
Yes.
In our homes. I remember I was 6 years old, and we used to have this Christmas party back in the village, and alcohol used to be the thing where at the end of the year we are celebrating, we buy cases, we do this, and we'd be dancing, having fun. And then those two people who've had too much to drink because they don't know just how to have one, next thing they're fighting, and those are behaviors that are normalized from the time that we are 6. So I think to whoever's listening to this, it's not a judgment. I hope they know that. It's more of, let's start the conversations even in our friendship groups, because those are where the conversations start, in our homes. Like, to your point, your mom sends you something every Sunday. She'd rather believe the church than believe a whole professor that she raised. Because for them, it's a personal thing to feel like, this is my family. They've been with me through thick and thin. It's my church. I would rather believe that information than science. So it's in those spaces that we should be having the conversations. So thank you so much for just making it so accessible. Thank you. And we will see you next week, Monday. I'm not sure what we're going to be speaking about yet. I think it's going to be boundaries. I'm not sure. But every week I have, I wake up at midnight saying, okay, I really think we should be speaking about this. And this was one of those conversations, because I just realized that we all think we're exempt, and we need to start reframing our thinking patterns, the conversations we have with ourselves and others, but also not fostering toxic spaces. Because I think that's the other thing that we do as a generation. I grew up in a world that told me the cause was the cure. So you go out with friends and you feel like the only way to be social is if you have a drink, but you're not mindful of what you're actually doing. And then 10 years later, you're actually really understanding what it is that you are putting into your body. And I think, again, to the point of this conversation, the point of this podcast is not to bombard you with information. It's actually just to make it a lot more accessible. So if there's something else based on this conversation that you'd like us to discuss, I have them on WhatsApp. Just let us know. Thank you so much. See you next week.